Is it all right to have sex on the Sabbath?
In all evangelistic meetings, this question comes floating through, and it has to do with Sabbath sex.
Should believers have sex on the Sabbath? Welcome to Thoughts, Camera, Action. Now, if you're looking at this video, I'm assuming that you would like to know the answer. And you could be new to the Sabbath observance or quite mature in the Sabbath truth, but are perhaps indecisive in regards to whether sex on the Sabbath is permissible or not. This short video will examine popular conjecture and will give the biblical answer towards the end. I hope you find this interesting and, as always, provoking thought.
In all evangelistic meetings, this question comes floating through, and it has to do with Sabbath sex. What do you mean by that, preacher? Well, it would appear that somebody's misapplying Isaiah 58, 13, and 14.
The book of Isaiah, chapter 58, verse 13.
Yes.
If thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day.
That's all I wanted right there. So some of these other Israelite camps out there, they teach you can't have sex on the Sabbath day based on this scripture. On this scripture right here, I was like, man, what about this scripture says you can't have sex on the Sabbath? Like, I don't understand. What about this is making reference to intercourse?
It's really just sad, man. You know, it's just sad. And that's why I didn't want to speak on it, but the Spirit kept, poking at it. Scriptures speak about perverting the scriptures, adding to the scriptures, taking away from the scriptures. You can't take away from the scriptures and their meaning, man. When you do that, you putting yourself in the way of damnation. All right? But now when you sit up there and speak of polluting the Sabbath or doing things that the Most High commanded us not to do, such as having sex, I mean, if you go back and for you to talk about the law and your boast be the law, back in the time during Moses, if a man was put to death for just picking up sticks to light a fire, right? How much more you think a man would be if they knew you up in there, knocking boots?
See, Adam and Eve were created on Friday. Do you think they waited till Sunday? But then some folk like to bring up a particular text, and they say, the text says that we should not do our own pleasure on the Sabbath. It's not telling us that we can't do anything pleasurable on the Sabbath, because that would make the Sabbath a burden indeed. The notion that the Sabbath forbids joyous pleasure during these hours is a misreading of that original text. See, if this text actually forbids sex because it's pleasurable, then any type of pleasure would be forbidden on the Sabbath. If you love good Sabbath cooked meals and you love to chow down after church, if you read the text that way, it means that too is forbidden.
You can't what?
So I was talking to Sister Matthews today in church, and she was telling me about that verse in the Bible about not doing thine own pleasure on the Sabbath. And, I mean, this is pleasurable, so.
What you talking about the verse in Isaiah?
Yeah, I think that's where it is.
The Old Testament?
Mm-hmm.
The same testament where it tells you to sacrifice your first livestock?
The same testament that has the 10 Commandments in it. Yes, that's one. That's the one. But it's still the Bible.
Don't do thy own pleasure, right? Yeah. All right, fine, whatever. Cool, fine.
Now, are you ready for the answer? I mean, are you really ready for the answer? Now, before stumbling across this particular verse, I must say that I kind of was of two opinions, because I was hearing it time and time by, people of reputable reputations in churches who were saying that it was alright to do what you need to do on the Sabbath, even though sometimes I would be pricked and I'd be like, I don't feel like it is. I would never have a thus saith the Lord or a scripture to substantiate. However, once I found this scripture, I wasn't even looking for it, but it just brought the nail to the coffin. Now, if you really want to know the answer, it's coming up next. The Book of Jubilees, sometimes called Lesser Genesis, is an ancient Jewish religious work of 50 chapters, considered canonical by the Ethiopian Church as well as Beta Israel, where it is known as the Book of Division. Between 1947 and 1956, approximately 15 Jubilee scrolls were found in the 5 caves at Qumran, all written in Hebrew. The large number of manuscripts, more than for any biblical books except for Psalms, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Exodus, and Genesis in descending order, indicates that Jubilees was widely used at Qumran. It says, "And behold the commandment regarding the Sabbaths. I have written them down for thee, and all the judgments of its laws. 6 days without labour, but on the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it ye shall do no manner of work, ye and your sons and your men servants and your maid servants and your cattle, and the sojourner also who is with you, and the man that doeth any work on it shall die. Whosoever desecrateth that day, whoever lieth with his wife, or whosoever saith he will do something on it, that he will set out on a journey thereon, in regard to any buying or selling, and whoever draweth water thereon, which he had not prepared for himself on the 6th day, and whosoever taketh up any burden to carry it out of his tent, or out of his house, shall die." So it seems that Jubilees unequivocally, unbiasedly, unambiguously, no grey, is saying that having sex even with a married spouse is forbidden, even on the Sabbath day.
Her priests have violated my law and have profaned mine holy things. They have put no difference between the holy and profane. Neither have they showed difference between the unclean and the clean, and have hid their eyes from my Sabbaths, and I am profaned among them.
It says, "And behold the commandment regarding the Sabbaths. I've written them down for you, and all the judgments of its laws. 6 days you shall labor, but on the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no manner of work, you or your sons, or your men servants, and your maidservants, and all your cattle, and the sojourner also who's with you. And the man that does any work on it shall die. Whoever desecrates that day, whoever lies with his wife." Dun, dun, dun. Yes, guys, this is saying don't have sex on the Sabbath.
We just lost half our subscribership.
Don't have sex on the Sabbath.
We'll go over that.
Well, we can stop right here because
Okay.
we need to.
All right, yeah.
Why, sweetie, do you think that the instructions for Sabbath would say refrain from sex with your wife because you're not having sex with anyone else?
Right.
So refrain from sex with your wife on Sabbath.
Okay, well, if we go back into Leviticus, the cleanliness laws, and the act of coming to the tabernacle with sacrifices, and for holy convocation means gathering.
Mhm.
So, yes, the Sabbath day is mainly about rest, but people also gathered to worship at the temple. Now, worship involved sacrifice.
Right.
So people were able to bring their if you were working all week and you needed to bring a sin sacrifice, Sabbath was probably the day to do
That's the
that
day to do
because
it.
you were off of,
Yep.
So if you had any kind of emission, and especially with intercourse, you were
Okay.
unclean.
Okay.
But the cleanliness laws would actually make it impossible for you to go and do your worship on the Sabbath at the tabernacle that day because you weren't in a situation to actually be able to approach the tabernacle. So being unclean in and of itself, and the act of intercourse with a man and a wife who are lawfully married, that is not sin.
It's not
That is
sin.
not wickedness,
Nope.
but it renders you into a physical state where
unclean.
if you approach the tabernacle, you could be a grease spot like that because you're unclean and you're going into the presence where the glory cloud of the Father is going to be.
In a severe sense, like in the tabernacle that's in a meeting
At
with
that time,
with the angel that was hovering above it, that was yes, you some bad things could happen. But we also talked about this in our leprosy videos. This also could cause the leprosy to break out on you or your clothes. If you came unclean before the tabernacle, which is God's holy presence, and you're unclean. So this is why the Father, for your own good, for your own benefit, was like, hey, this act, even though it's good with your wife, even though it's appropriate, even though it's not sinful, this act will make you unclean, and that may not be good for you if you come into my holy presence. So therefore, this is why you would not want to have sex on the Sabbath, because normally you're trying to keep it set apart, right?
Yeah.
Not to do your own pleasure thereon, right? Yes, sex with your wife is your own pleasure. Let's just be real about it.
I mean, okay. So we have a question in the chat about, we don't have a tabernacle now. So isn't it okay?
Right.
Eating pork makes you unclean. You couldn't go to the tabernacle if you ate pork. Now, it's very easy for all of us to say, well, pork just isn't food. But still, the Father lists that as something that makes you unclean. He acknowledges there may come a time where you do that.
Right.
Okay, if that happens, you're unclean. All of us agree we shouldn't eat pork. The point that I try to get to with this ultimate topic, for me personally, why it's a conviction of mine to go ahead and follow this, even though we're not at the tabernacle, that act takes my mind completely off of the Father and places it solely on pleasuring the flesh. Right. And it's not again, between a married couple, that's not a sin in and of itself. But if we're talking about setting his day apart and making it different from all the other days of the week, we've got 6 whole other days that we can engage in that activity. Must we save it for the 24-hour time period of Shabbat? Does it have to be done on that day? The same people who will tell you not to go to a wedding on the Sabbath because it takes your focus off the Father and puts it on the bride will possibly also tell you to reject Jubilees because it says not to have sex on Shabbat, and that's how dare Jubilees say that. That's so wrong for it to be said. There's also the aspect of the Sabbath being a prophetic foreshadowing of the kingdom. That's
what I was going to say, guys. All this stuff, whether you're not eating pork, whether you're not having sex, whether you're, all the things that would make you unclean, that keeps you from the temple of God, the presence of God. That's what the kingdom is called. And the New Jerusalem is considered the tabernacle of God that comes down to the earth and is among men. So the whole idea is when you're resurrected in your glorified immortal body and you're living in the kingdom, you won't have emissions from your body. You won't be having sex. Yeshua tells us no one's getting married at the resurrection. You won't need the need for marriage between man and woman won't be there anymore because you're immortal now. So you're not marrying anybody at the resurrection. So there is no sex for anyone because you're not having sex outside of marriage. That's for sure. That's what the rebellious angels did. And that's why they were being destroyed in the lake of fire. So as well as you're not working for profit. Isaiah 55, the bride says, come, all you who want milk and meat, buy without food, buy without cost. So keep that in your mind as we read these instructions. There's no marriage and there'll definitely be no sex in the kingdom. So this is practice, regardless if there's a temple on the ground or not. You practice all the other Torahs, all the other instructions.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So the slippery slope with, well, there's no tabernacle now, so we don't have to worry about intercourse on the Sabbath. Okay. Then we don't have to worry about any of the feast days, guys.
Right.
Because every single feast day, all the holy convocations, we're required to bring things to a temple in the land for all of those. So if we're going to say, well, I can have intercourse with my spouse on Shabbat because I don't have to worry about being unclean. That may be true, technically. Like women who worry about their monthly periods and, they can't sit on the same couch as their husband. Some women have whole separate beds and things like that because they think they're not supposed to get someone else make them unclean. Those commandments aren't about, well, it's bad to become unclean. Don't let anyone become unclean. All you women separate yourselves so that no one becomes unclean. It's what happens when you inevitably become unclean. Here's what you can't do. Here's what you can do. Here's how long until you can come back and do these things. So it's about balance. You can be relaxed about some of the cleanliness laws in the sense of, all right, these are things that it's not wrong for my husband to sit on the same couch as me. I mean, the scriptures don't say don't sit on the same couch. It just says what happens when you do sit on the same couch. But also trying to balance, you know, how you're actually honoring the things that we can't do according to the letter while we're in the dispersion, we should still be trying to honor those things in the ways that we can. If you feel convicted to have a separate chair during your monthly times, I'm not knocking it, okay? But also that can get into some of the being way too, you know, legalistic and concerned about things you don't necessarily have to be concerned about. So
which leads perfectly into this statement
Yes.
I put on screen, okay? Which is 100 Esperanza Anderson. Yes, I agree. We should be concerned when it pertains to what the context of what we're talking about. So yes, like we're just talking about, the idea of practicing this behavior that we'll be experiencing eternally in the kingdom. And one of those is keeping the Sabbath. And one of those instructions for keeping the Sabbath is not having sex. And that's something that we practice and discipline as a part of our discipleship. That word lends to discipline. Discipleship in Yeshua is that married couples would refrain from sex while they're resting and focusing on God on the Sabbath. So this is where you would practice being clean, but don't let that take you into a place where you say, if it's not Sabbath, that you're refraining from your husband's need for intimacy because suddenly you think, oh, we got to be clean.
Yeah.
I don't want to be unclean. Like, don't let it turn you into a hypochondriac, right? That's not the idea. That's going overboard into a ditch, right? So we want to stay on the straight and narrow because the scripture tells us, you know, the man and woman should come together. Paul even instructs us that if you should take any separation in sex between a married couple, let it not be for too long, lest one of you becomes tempted, right? So this is a very big deal. So this is why we want to treat this with as much care and concern as possible. Yes, being in this specific context, focusing on becoming clean or staying clean, I should say, during the Sabbath, so that you are just practicing for what you'll experience in the kingdom. Yes, we're not in ancient Israel. We don't have to go to a temple with sacrifices and be clean to be checked by a priest. But at the same time, we're practicing now for what's going to come to fulfillment in the kingdom come.